Greetings, friend, and welcome. So glad you could join us for Bedtime Biographies, where together we unwind and drift away to the soothing accounts of truly remarkable lives. Our journey this evening begins in the 19th century. The air is thick with coal smoke, factories groaned like tired giants, and a man with a famously unruly beard sits in the British Library, scribbling furious notes in the margins of books. His name's Karl Marx. His mission? To explain why the world felt so broken and why, just maybe, it didn't have to stay that way. Before we properly begin Marx's story, just a brief thought. If these calm explorations of significant lives help you unwind, please consider taking a moment to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps other curious minds discover these stories, and we're always curious for your reflections. Let us know in the comments below, what do you think of Marx, and which historical figure you'd like us to explore in our next bedtime biography. Now, Marxism gets thrown around a lot, sometimes as a slogan, sometimes as a scare word, but strip away the noise, and at its heart, it's really just a question. What if work didn't have to hurt? What if the things we make, the clothes we sew, the food we grow, the houses we build actually belong to the people who make them? Marx spent his life chasing that idea through bankruptcies, exiles, and a lot of very bad cups of coffee. Of course, history took his theories and ran wild. The revolutions, manifestos, governments rising and falling in his name. But tonight, we are not here for the fireworks. We're just here to meet the man behind the myth, a brilliant, stubborn, deeply human thinker who wanted a fairer world. And now, as the day winds down, let's begin to trace the life and times of this deeply influential thinker. This is the bedtime biography of Karl Marx. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Would Unmake the World. The story begins in 1818 in the quiet riverside town of Trier, Germany, a place where Roman ruins crumbled gently into the Moselle River and the vineyards stretched sleepy and green under the summer sun. Here, in an unassuming house on Bruckenglasses Strasse, a boy named Karl Marx took his first breaths. His father, Heinrich, was a respected lawyer with Enlightenment ideals dancing in his head, a man who had converted from Judaism to Lutheranism more for career prospects than spiritual awakening. Young Karl would inherit that pragmatic streak, along with something far more combustible. The Marx household hummed with intellectual energy. Heimlich filled the home with volumes from Voltaire and Kant, while Karl's mother, Henrietta, kept the pantry stocked with Dutch cheese and the children stocked with old Dutch proverbs. Young Karl absorbed it all, the books, the debates, the sense that the world might be reshaped by reason. By the time he reached the Friedrich Wilhelm Gymnasium, his teachers noted two things. First, that the boy wrote essays of startling depth for his age, and second, that he possessed what one instructor called a most unsettling habit of interrogating every premise placed before him. At 17, Marx penned his graduation essay on the union of the faithful with Christ. The language was conventional, but between the lines posed something radical, a vision of humanity united not by dogma, but by shared struggle. It was as if the young man already sensed the theme that would consume his life, that our earthly bonds matter more than heavenly ones. His headmaster, perhaps sensing trouble ahead, wrote in Karl's leaving certificate that while the student showed brilliance, his work suffered from an overabundance of intellectual energy. Meanwhile, the Rhine Valley around him whispered of older stories. The ruins of Roman amphitheaters stirred alongside medieval guild halls, all overshadowed by the Prussian bureaucracy that now governed Trier. The contradictions piled up like the vineyard terraces, ancient and modern, free and fettered, sacred and profane. Marx would spend his life dissecting such contradictions, though he couldn't have known it yet. For now, he was simply a bright young man with a shock of dark hair and a restlessness that no amount of Rhine wine could soothe. His father dreamed Karl would become a lawyer, respectable, comfortable, a continuation of the Marx family's hard-won bourgeois stability. But the boy who had grown up between Enlightenment books and Prussian censorship, between Jewish roots and Lutheran conversion, was already nursing questions too dangerous for courtrooms. In 1835, he left for university, carrying a trunk of clothes, a head of ideas, and a heart primed for rebellion. The quiet banks of the Moselle would see him only occasionally after that, the prodigal son returning between exiles, each time a little more radical, a little more convinced that the world needed not careful reform, but revolutionary change. And now, as the day winds down, let's begin to trace the life and times of this deeply influential thinker. This is the Bedtime Biography of Karl Marx. Chapter 2. Hegel's Angry Apprentice. The university years arrived like a storm, shaking loose whatever bourgeois restraints still clung to young Marx. Born in 1835, was all tavern brawls and dueling scars, a far cry from Trier's sleepy vineyards. 18-year-old Karl dove in head first, joining the Poets' Club, running up debts for fine tailored coats and Spanish cigars, even getting arrested for drunkenness one rowdy night. His father's letters grew increasingly desperate, mixing financial reprimands with paternal concern. "Your wild rampaging through the nocturnal streets," Heinrich wrote, "might perhaps be excused in a teenager, but not in a future statesman." But Marx wasn't destined for statesmanship. By 1836, he transferred to Berlin, trading Rhine wine for Prussian austerity. The University of Berlin's lecture halls smelled of ink and ambition, humming with the ideas of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel's philosophy that history progressed through dialectical clashes of opposing forces electrified Marx. He joined the young Hegelians, a circle of radical thinkers who took Hegel's methods and turned them against the Prussian state itself. Nights blurred into days in smoke-filled rooms where they debated religion as the opium of the people and monarchy as an outdated relic. The transformation was startling. The law student who'd arrived in Berlin with dreams of a respectable career now scribbled passionate poetry about hellish darkness and the gods' downfall. His father, watching this philosophical rebellion unfold through increasingly erratic letters, grew frantic. "For God's sake," Heinrich pleaded, "when will you start living like a proper Christian and stop consorting with these atheistic intellectuals?" But Marx had already slipped his leash. He stopped attending formal lectures altogether, letting his official studies wither while he devoured philosophy, history, and economics. By 1839, Marx was researching his doctoral thesis on ancient Greek materialism, a sly rebuke to the idealist philosophy dominating Germany. He submitted it not to conservative Berlin, but to the more liberal University of Jena, receiving his Ph.D. in 1841 at just 23. The newly minted Dr. Marx imagined an academic career, but the Prussian government had other ideas. When his mentor, Bruno Bauer, was fired for radical views, Marx understood the university gates were closed to him. And so the young philosopher stepped onto a different path, one that led not to ivory towers, but to radical journalism, revolutionary politics, and eventually into the waiting arms of a certain factory owner's son, named Friedrich Engels. But that meeting, like so much else, would have to wait. For now, Marx left Berlin with a degree he couldn't use, ideas too dangerous for Prussia, and a restlessness that would carry him across Europe and into history. The party student was about to become a revolutionary. The hangovers would continue, but now they'd be accompanied by something far more potent, a rising fury at the world as it was,
and a burning determination to remake it. Chapter 3. The Censor's Nemesis. The ink-stained radical found his first battleground not in the streets, but in the pages of a struggling newspaper. Cologne, 1842. Marx, now 24 and brimming with untested theories, took the helm of the Rheinische Zeitung. The liberal publication became his laboratory, each editorial a carefully aimed dart at Prussian authoritarianism. He wrote about the plight of Moselle wine growers crushed by taxes, mocked the censors who redacted his articles, and slowly honed his signature style, that potent mix of scholarly rigor and biting sarcasm. The paper's circulation tripled under his leadership, much to the government's dismay. But Prussian patience wore thin when Marx defended the right of peasants to gather fallen wood from aristocratic forests, his first serious engagement with property rights. The authorities pounced. The paper was shuttered in March 1843, its final issue printed entirely in red ink as a defiant farewell. Marx, now blacklisted across German states, faced a choice: silence or exile. He chose exile with typical flourish, marrying his sweetheart, Jenny von Westphalen, that summer before crossing into France. Paris in 1843 was a revelation. The air smelled of revolution and cheap tobacco, its cafes buzzing with political exiles from across Europe. Here, Marx discovered something Prussia had never allowed, a space where radical ideas could breathe. He plunged into the city's intellectual underground, debating with anarchists and utopian socialists late into the night. It was during these fevered months that Marx began his lifelong project, stripping away capitalism's polished surface to expose its grinding machinery. Late one evening, hunched over a desk in their cramped apartment, Marx showed Jenny his latest notes. "These French thinkers," he muttered, "they dream beautifully, but build castles in the air." His fingers left smudges on the page as he traced connections between philosophy and economics, between ideas and the workers who actually moved history. Jenny, ever his first editor, pointed to a particularly dense passage. "Too abstract," she said. "If you want to change things, you'll need to speak to people's actual lives." That lesson would stay with Marx as Paris sharpened his thinking. He co-founded the Deutsche Französische Jahrbucher, a radical journal that lasted exactly one issue, before its Prussian backers got cold feet. But that single issue contained Marx's seminal essay on the Jewish question, his first major break from liberal politics. The essay's startling conclusion: true freedom required more than political rights. It demanded the overthrow of the economic system that alienated humans from their labor. As winter settled over Paris, Marx's beard grew thicker, his critiques sharper. Prussian spies took note of the dangerous young German holding court at the Café de la Région. By January 1845, the French government, pressured by Berlin, issued an expulsion order. Marx packed his books again, this time heading for Brussels. He didn't know it yet, but his years of wandering exile had only just begun. Nor could he guess that his most fateful encounter with a sharp-eyed textile heir, who just published a scathing indictment of English factories, waited just around the corner. The radical journalist was about to meet his other half.
Chapter 4. The Capitalist Who Funded the Revolution. The encounter that would alter history happened almost by accident. Paris, August 1844. A café near the Rue Vanneau, where the air hung thick with coffee, steam, and revolutionary torque. Friedrich Engels, just 24, but already hardened, by 2 years working in his father's Manchester textile firm, had sought Marx out after reading his Jahrbucher essays. Their first meeting a year earlier had been cool. Marx, the philosophical heavyweight, had dismissed the young businessman as just another utopian socialist. But this time, Engels arrived armed with something irresistible: data. He slurred the manuscript across the table, its pages smudged with factory grime and ink. The condition of the working class in England laid bare the horrors Engels had witnessed. Children with spines curved from 16-hour shifts, workers coughing up lint from mills, their entire families trading dignity for pennies. Marx, who had theorized about alienation from the comfort of libraries, found himself staring at the visceral reality. As Engels spoke, his voice low but urgent, about wage slavery and the machinery of exploitation, something clicked. "We finished each other's sentences," Engels would later recall. By last call, they were plotting a collaboration. Their partnership became the engine of revolutionary theory. Engels, the practical observer who'd pawn his boots to buy Marx ink, grounded abstract brilliance in concrete detail. Marx, the relentless systematizer, transformed Engels' observations into sweeping historical analysis. Together they wrote The Holy Family, a blistering takedown of their former young Hegelian friends. The writing sessions ran deep into the night, fueled by cheap wine and Engels' seemingly bottomless supply of cigars. "The only luxury I allow myself," he joked, though he'd soon inherit the very capitalist machinery he despised. Jenny Marx, watching from the doorway, would smile at the sight of her husband actually laughing for once, his usual brooding intensity lightened by Engels' dry wit. But their bond went beyond intellect. When Marx was expelled from Paris in 1845, Engels followed him to Brussels without hesitation, though he was still just a clerk living on scraps from his father. Later, as a factory partner, Engels would become Marx's reluctant lifeline, funneling portions of his bourgeois income to the family that denounced bourgeoisie. Someone had to make money, Engels sighed, and it certainly wasn't going to be Karl. And when the two men needed to test their theories against reality, they embarked on a 6-week tour of English industrial slums.
Manchester's textile mills became their classroom, the misery they witnessed there hardening their conviction that capitalism wasn't just flawed, but doomed. By 1847, their ideas had crystallized enough to attract the League of the Just at a London pub called the Red Lion. Marx and Engels rewrote the League's manifesto into something sharper, fiercer. As Engels paced the draft aloud, the assembled workers leaned forward. The document's famous final line, "Workers of the world, unite," wasn't just rhetoric. It was a battle cry, forged in the space between Marx's philosophical fire and Engels' first-hand knowledge of oppression. The theorist and the witness, the rebel and his banker, a partnership that began over a cafe table, would go on to shake empires funded, ironically, by the very system it sought to destroy. Chapter 5. 23 pages that shook the world. The League of the Just had been whispering about revolution for years, a scattered network of German exiles and disgruntled tailors meeting in London's back rooms. But when Marx and Engels arrived in 1847 with their manifesto draft, the whispers became a roar. The group renamed itself the Communist League, shedding its old conspiratorial mysticism for something bolder, a scientific blueprint for class war. That winter in Brussels, Marx's cramped apartment became the League's unofficial headquarters. Jenny Marx served tea to a rotating cast of shoemakers and printers, while her husband paced, dictating passages that would become the Communist Manifesto. Engels, ever the editor, trimmed Marx's Germanic sentences into razor-sharp prose. "A specter is haunting Europe," Marx began one midnight, pausing as Engels scribbled a marginal note. Too poetic, but the phrase stayed, its ominous rhythm perfect for the coming storm. The manifesto was less a book than a detonation, just 23 pages that reduced human history to a single law. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. It painted capitalism as a vampiric system, praised the bourgeoisie for its revolutionary destruction of feudalism, then declared its inevitable collapse. The writing crackled with caustic wit. The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest into its paid wage laborers. When revolution erupted in Paris in February 1848, toppling the monarchy in 3 chaotic days, the manifesto seemed prophetic. Marx, expelled from Brussels, raced to Paris, as exiled German radicals hailed him as their theorist. By April, he'd launched a new radical paper in Cologne, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, urging German workers to push beyond bourgeois reforms. Engels, ever the soldier philosopher, took up arms with revolutionary fighters in Baden. But the tide turned fast. By 1849, Prussian troops crushed the rebellions. Marx's paper was shut down, its final issue printed in defiant red ink. Facing arrest, he fled to London with Jenny, now pregnant with their 4th child, and what little remained of their possessions. Engels, after a harrowing escape through Switzerland, followed. As they regrouped in a damp Soho tenement, the scale of their failure became clear. The revolutions had collapsed, the Communist League was in tatters, and their manifesto had sold barely 100 copies. Yet in that cramped exile, something curious happened. The manifesto began circulating underground, smuggled into Germany in bales of cotton, passed hand to hand in French workers' circles. A text written in haste was becoming scripture for a movement just beginning to stir. Marx couldn't know then that his pamphlet's most famous lines would one day echo in every language on earth. For now, there was only the damp London cold, the cries of his malnourished children, and the slow, stubborn work of thinking anew. Chapter 6. The Museum Prophet. London in the 1850s greeted the Marx family like a damp, unrelenting cough. Their 2-room flat in Soho's Dean Street smelled of stale bread and wet wool. The walls so thin they could hear their neighbors' arguments verbatim. Marx, now stateless and penniless, spent his mornings trudging through the fog to the British Museum's reading room, a temple of knowledge, where he could warm his frozen fingers while studying parliamentary reports on factory conditions. The attendants knew him as that German doctor who occupied the same seat from opening until closing, surrounded by teetering stacks of books, his marginal notes growing increasingly furious as he traced capitalism's veins through dry economic data. At home, the reality was grimmer. 3 of their children, Guido, Francisca, and Edgar, would die in those years, victims of malnutrition and the tuberculosis that flourished in London's tenements. Marx pawned his coat in winter to buy medicine, then sat shivering as he wrote articles for the New York Tribune under the pseudonym A London Correspondent, ironic dispatches about European politics that paid just enough to keep the bailiffs at bay. Jenny, once a Prussian aristocrat's daughter, learned to stretch a single loaf of bread across 3 days, her hands red from scrubbing clothes in the shared washtub. Yet in this private darkness, Marx was assembling what would become his life's work. The notes he scribbled in the museum, filled with equations tracking cotton prices alongside worker starvation, were the first threads of Kapital. He wrote in a frenzy, often standing at his desk to stay awake, his children's coughs drifting through the thin walls. When little Edgar died in 1855, Marx buried his grief in work, telling Engels, "I must save what can still be saved." The manuscript grew in fits and starts, interrupted by boils on his skin, nervous eruptions from stress, and squabbles with other exiled revolutionaries who accused him of abandoning practical politics for theory. Through it all, Engels remained the lifeline. His monthly remittances, Marx's sardonic term for the money, arrived like clockwork, though Engels himself was trapped in Manchester, managing the family firm he loathed. Their letters chronicled the absurd duality of their lives. Engels describing textile profits that funded Marx's rent, while Marx detailed his latest discoveries about surplus value, the hidden theft embedded in every industrial ledger. By 1857, a global financial crash sent Marx rushing back to the museum with renewed urgency. "The deluge is coming," he wrote to Engels, convinced capitalism's contradictions would finally explode. Instead, the system adapted. Factories reopened, and Marx, still unpublished, found himself again at square one. But something had shifted in those years of quiet desperation. The man who emerged from the 1850s was no longer the fiery young journalist, but a scholar who had stared into Capital's abyss and begun mapping its contours. The first volume of Kapital remained unfinished.
Its pages stained with tea and tobacco, but its central insight now burned clear that the whole system rested on a simple, brutal alchemy, the conversion of human sweat into gold, of living labor into dead capital, and Marx, the eternal exile, would spend the rest of his life documenting that crime in meticulous, world-shattering detail. Chapter 7. The Monster in the British Museum. By the 1860s, Marx had become a permanent fixture of the British Museum's reading room, the shaggy, ink-stained specter haunting the economics section. The attendants knew his routine: arrive at opening bell, claim seat 07, demand the latest factory inspection reports, and scribble furious notes until his hands cramped. His beard had gone gray, his cough worsened by London's pea-soup fog, but his mind burned hotter than ever. On the desk before him, a monstrous manuscript drew like some unholy cross between a PhD thesis and a Molotov cocktail. Its name, Das Kapital. Its mission, to autopsy capitalism down to its twitching, bloodless heart. The writing process was equal parts scholarly rigor and slapstick tragedy. Marx's carbuncles, those painful boils plaguing him since the 1850s, flared up whenever he sat too long, forcing him to write standing up like some Victorian-era standing desk enthusiast. His letters to Engels read like a hypochondriac's diary. "The damned boils have migrated to my," making both thinking and sitting equally impossible. Meanwhile, Jenny pawned the family silver again to buy paper, while little Eleanor Marx, age 6, practiced her letters by copying out passages about commodity fetishism. Domestic life had become a bizarre blend of bourgeois routine and revolutionary fervor. Breakfast conversations might veer from little Laura's piano lessons to the precise rate at which factory owners sucked the life from workers. Capital wasn't so much written as exhumed, each chapter mined from 20 years of research. Marx filled it with Gothic horror stories of industrial England, children's bones softening from phosphorus fumes, seamstresses collapsing after 30-hour shifts, entire families living in workhouse coffins, literally. Some London shelters rented out wooden boxes for a penny a night. He deployed sarcasm like a scalpel, dedicating pages to mocking the theological niceties of economists who treated markets as natural laws rather than human inventions. The book's central metaphor, capital as a vampire draining living labor, wasn't just rhetoric. It was the scream of a man who'd spent too many nights reading factory inspectors' reports by gaslight. When Volume 1 finally published in 1867, the silence was deafening. The initial print run of 1,000 copies gathered dust in Hamburg warehouses. The Times of London ignored it. Even fellow socialists grumbled about its density. August Bebel complained it gave him headaches. Only Engels grasped its explosive potential, writing fake reviews in German papers to drum up interest, a guerrilla marketing campaign of all Electra. Slowly, improbably, it found its audience. Self-taught factory workers in Leipzig passing its equations after shifts,
Russian nihilists smuggling copies past the Tsar census, even the odd curious bourgeois who presumably needed help sleeping. The critics who did engage missed the point entirely. One German reviewer praised Marx's fine literary style while dismissing his economics, like complimenting a guillotine's polished blade. Others fixated on his supposed materialism, overlooking the profound and often grim human story woven into its economic arguments. Beneath the data, Marx was charting a system he saw as inherently unstable, marked by widespread alienation and cycles of crisis and Brapesting, one that he believed carried the seeds of its own eventual momentous change. Through it all, Marx kept revising, expanding, and, in classic Marx fashion, procrastinating. Volumes 2 and 3 existed only as chaotic drafts, their pages littered with digressions about medieval land rights and the chemical composition of fertilizer. He'd promised Engels just 6 more weeks of edits, then disappear down rabbit holes for months, emerging with 50 new pages on cotton spinning techniques, but 0 completed chapters. The project became his white whale, his King Lear, his never-ending chess game against an economic system that kept changing the rules. And yet, for all its unfinished state, Kapital achieved something remarkable. It made the invisible visible, turning the mundane horrors of factory life into evidence of a system built on stolen time. When Manchester textile workers began quoting its passages at union meetings, when German socialists used its formulas to calculate fair wages, Marx allowed himself a rare moment of pride. The book that began as a whisper in the British Museum was becoming a weapon, one that would outlive its author, its first readers, even the 19th century itself. The monster was loose. Chapter 8. The International Brotherhood of Very Angry Men. London, September 28, 1864. A large public meeting convened at St. Martin's Hall in Longacre, the air buzzing with anticipation and the fervent discussions of a diverse assembly. French Proudhonists, Italian Republicans, British trade unionists, and German exiles whose revolutionary zeal had not waned since 1848, gathered all championing workers' rights in a medley of languages. Karl Marx was a pivotal figure in attendance, soon to become the leading mind of the International Working Men's Association, history's first socialist supergroup, which was founded at this very event. The First International was born from equal parts idealism and desperation. European workers were getting crushed between industrial capitalism's gears, English textile mills paying starvation wages, French miners living like moles underground, German children losing fingers in factories. Marx, now playing elder statesman at 46, saw an opportunity. "We must become the generals of the working class," he told Engels, though neither had ever held a gun. The plan? Unite every radical faction under one banner. The problem? Radicals hate unity almost as much as they hate capitalists. Marx's genius was making the International's founding documents vague enough to please everyone. The statutes promised the emancipation of the working classes, without specifying how. The inaugural address, penned by Marx in one caffeine-fueled night, denounced capitalism with Shakespearean flair. The misery of the working masses has not diminished from 1848 to 1864, while carefully avoiding words like revolution or dictatorship.
It was revolutionary politics, as Rorschach test. French anarchists saw decentralized communes, British trade unionists saw better wages, and Marx saw the seeds of his scientific socialism. For a glorious few years, it worked. The International became a clearinghouse for labor unrest across Europe. When Paris bronze workers went on strike, London dockers sent funds. When Swiss factory owners cut wages, German pamphlets appeared mysteriously in workers. Marx, the nominal head of this ragtag empire, spent his days mediating between factions while secretly maneuvering to purge anarchists from the ranks. His nemesis? Michael Bakunin, a bear-sized Russian anarchist who believed in spontaneous uprisings and allegedly ate 12 raw eggs for breakfast. Their ideological feud played out in increasingly petty letters, Marx mocking Bakunin's childish plans, Bakunin calling Marx a slippery Jew. The whole experiment came crashing down in 1872, when Marx basically pulled a corporate takeover. Fearing Bakunin's faction would win control, he had the International's headquarters moved to New York, the 19th century equivalent of transferring your rival's department to Antarctica. The organization limped along for 4 more years before dissolving, bankrupt and divided. Yet like most of Marx's failures, the First International left fingerprints everywhere. It proved workers could organize across borders. It turned terms like proletariat and bourgeoisie into household words. And it gave us the original leftist infighting playbook. Every socialist schism since, from Trotskyists versus Stalinists to Bernie Brothers versus Warren Democrats, owes something to those smoke-filled rooms. Marx himself was characteristically unsentimental about the collapse. The International has done its work, he shrugged, already elbow-deep in notes for Kapital's next volume. Besides, history had a funny way of resurrecting his projects when least expected. Within months, Parisian workers would rise up in the Commune, and suddenly everyone would be quoting Marx again. Chapter 972, Days That Shook the World. Paris, March 1871. The city smells of gunpowder and fresh-baked bread, an unlikely combination that perfectly captures the moment. The workers have taken control, not through some carefully plotted Marxist revolution, but because the French government has literally fled, abandoning the capital to the Prussians and its own citizens. What emerges is history's first workers' state, the Paris Commune, a chaotic experiment in radical democracy where waiters debate economics in City Hall and artists redesign the school curriculum. Our bearded theorist in London nearly chokes on his tea when he hears the news. After decades predicting proletarian revolution, here it is, unfolding spontaneously, messily, and completely contrary to his expectations. The communards haven't, in Kapital, still barely selling, haven't waited for historical conditions to ripen, haven't even consulted him. For 2 months, Marx oscillates between exhilaration and sheer panic, firing off letters to Paris that arrive too late to matter. The Commune's innovations read like a socialist fever dream. Factories seized and turned into cooperatives, church property redistributed, the standing army abolished. A Hungarian midwife turned revolutionary, Nathalie Lamel, organizes free communal kitchens. A radical schoolteacher, Louise Michel, leads women's battalions to the barricades. The Louvre becomes a political club where artists debate workers' rights. It's everything Marx theorized and nothing like he imagined. Back in London, Engels paces their cramped study, gleefully updating battle maps as if watching a particularly exciting football match. They're holding Montmartre, he crows one day, only to groan the next. The Versailles have retaken the cannons. Marx, meanwhile, scribbles furious notes for what will become the Civil War in France. His analysis of the unfolding drama, his writing captures the Commune's tragic beauty, the glorious harbinger of a new society, even as he knows how this story ends. And oh, does it end! In May, the French government troops storm Paris with a brutality that shocks even veteran war correspondents. The cobblestones run red as some 20,000 communards are executed in a single week. Women are gunned down clutching their children. Radicals are lined up against the murder fédéré and shot so efficiently the wall still stands today, pockmarked with bullet holes. The Seine, witnesses claim, flows crimson for days. When the smoke clears, Marx's pamphlet becomes required reading for radicals worldwide. His description of the Commune as the finally discovered political form under which to work out the economic emancipation of labor gets quoted in every revolutionary circle, from St. Petersburg to Chicago. But privately, he's shaken. The workers had their chance and were massacred for it. The old man spends weeks staring at Parisian newspapers, tracing the execution lists with trembling fingers. The legacy of those 72 days will haunt socialist movements forever. Lenin will study the Commune's mistakes obsessively before 1917. Mao will cite its example. Even today, the phrase Paris Commune conjures both revolutionary romance and brutal caution. Proof that workers could govern themselves, and proof of what happens when they try. And as for our London exile, he's left with a paradox. History had finally followed his script, only to rewrite the ending in blood. The next revolution, he realizes, will need more than barricades and good intentions. It will need an army of its own. Chapter 1000, The Old Mole's Last Burrow. The 1870s arrived like a slow-motion avalanche of bad news. Marx's body is falling apart. His lungs wheeze like broken bellows. His skin erupts in angry boils, and his liver has apparently declared independence. The revolutionary who once wrote of capitalism's inevitable collapse now spends more time discussing his own inevitable collapse with a rotating cast of quack doctors. "I am a machine condemned to devour books," he groans to Engels, "and now the machine is breaking down." Jenny's cough worries him more. His wife of nearly 40 years, the Prussian aristocrat who chose exile and poverty beside him, now moves through their London home like a ghost. The woman who once hosted Europe's radicals in her parlor while quietly pawning the family silver can barely climb stairs without gasping. Marx reads her old letters when he can't sleep, the passionate notes from their youth, the frantic ones from their early exile years, and pretends not to notice the blood-stained handkerchiefs she hides in her sewing basket.
Work becomes his refuge. The British Museum attendants have grown accustomed to the sight of the shaggy old revolutionary limping to his usual seat, muttering about that idiot Bakunin under his breath. The volume to Kapital languishes in draft. Formed its pages a chaotic mix of economic formulas and ranting marginalia. Typical bourgeois nonsense. He's become the grand old man of socialism without ever finishing his masterpiece. The movement he inspired keeps evolving without his permission. German socialists win Reichstag seats through elections rather than uprisings. Russian radicals write to him as if he's the Oracle of Delphi, asking whether peasant communes could skip capitalism entirely. Even the English press treats him with a strange new respect. The Times runs a profile calling him the most feared thinker in Europe, which at least beats being ignored. Then comes the hammer blow, Jenny's death in 1881. Marx is too ill to attend the funeral, lying in bed listening to the rain patter against the window as they bury the woman who was his first editor's fiercest defender and last tether, the bourgeois respectability. When he finally visits the grave months later, he collapses into his daughter Eleanor's arms, sobbing so violently the cemetery attendants look away. The Moor is dead too, Engels tells friends afterward. The end comes 2 years later, in that familiar armchair by the fire. A housekeeper finds him slumped over, a half-written page on his lap. Yet another note about the Russian peasantry. The death certificate lists bronchitis and pleurisy, but anyone who knew him understood the real cause. 40 years of exile, grief, and 16-hour workdays will burn through even the toughest revolutionary. At the funeral in Highgate Cemetery, Engels delivers the eulogy to 11 mourners. His name will endure through the ages, he promised. though the London papers barely note the passing of this notorious agitator. The tombstone bears no mention of manifestos or revolutions, just that famous final call to action. Workers of all lands unite. Back in the empty house on Maitland Park Road, Engels opens the dreaded notebooks. 2 unfinished volumes of Kapital stare back at him in near indecipherable scroll, the chaotic legacy of history's most meticulous critic of chaos. The old soldier sighs, rolls up his sleeves, and reaches for the whiskey. The revolution, it seems, will need an editor. Chapter 11. The Prophets, Posthumous Career. The ink was barely dry on Marx's tombstone when the canonization began. 1880s Europe, groaning under the weight of industrial capitalism's excesses, suddenly found itself crawling with Marxists, or at least people who called themselves Marxists. In London pubs, German beer halls, and Russian study circles, arguments erupted over what the old man really meant. Engels, now the keeper of the sacred texts, spent his days fielding letters from fanatics and skeptics alike. No, he wrote for the 100th time to some overeager French socialist, Karl did not predict the revolution would arrive next Tuesday. The movement Marx left behind was splitting at the seams like a cheap suit. In Germany, Edward Bernstein argued capitalism could be reformed through parliament, earning himself the nickname Evolutionary Eddie from more radical comrades. In Russia, a young firebrand named Lenin pored over Kapital in Siberian exile, scribbling notes about how to skip the whole bourgeois democracy stage entirely. Meanwhile, anarchists and utopians kept trying to claim Marx's legacy, much to Engels' amusement. It's like watching children divide up an inheritance before the will's even been read, he grumbled. By the 1890s, Marx's ideas were undergoing the ultimate irony, becoming respectable. German Social Democrats won Reichstag seats using his rhetoric. British Fabians quoted him at tea parties. Even the odd brave professor began teaching Kapital, though usually with the disclaimer that it was purely academic. The books that gathered dust in warehouses now went through multiple printings, their margins filled with workers' pencil marks. That first edition Engels had hawked like snake oil, original copies now sold for a small fortune. The real turning point came in 1895, when Engels published Volume 3 of Kapital, a Frankenstein monster of a book stitched together from decades of notes. Critics pounced on its contradictions, not realizing they were arguing with a ghost. Marxist theories about capitalism's inevitable collapse suddenly seemed less convincing during Europe's economic boom. The old mole has gone blind, crowed a bourgeois newspaper. But history had a funny way of vindicating Marx just when everyone counted him out. The 1905 Russian Revolution, though crushed, proved workers could rise up, and Lenin's faction took careful notes. By 1914, the movement faced its greatest test when European socialist parties abandoned international solidarity to support their nation's war efforts. It seemed Marx's dream of worker unity had died in the trenches. But in Zurich, a certain bold revolutionary pored over the Communist Manifesto and saw opportunity in the carnage. Imperialism is capitalism's highest stage, Lenin wrote, giving Marx's theories a fresh coat of paint for the new century. Then came 1917, when the Bolsheviks stormed the Winter Palace. They did it under Marx's banner, literally. His face adorned their posters. His phrases filled their decrees. The man who'd spent his life as a penniless exile was now the patron saint of a workers' state. Back in Highgate Cemetery, someone placed a wreath on the grave inscribed, "Your theory became reality." Engels, had he lived to see it, might have wept, or possibly facepalmed, because this wasn't exactly what they'd envisioned. The revolution had come not in advanced industrial Germany, but backward peasant-filled Russia. The dictatorship of the proletariat looked suspiciously like, well, a dictatorship, and Marx's careful critique of capitalism was being turned into state dogma, with heresy trials for anyone who interpreted it differently. The ghost in the machine was loose, and nobody, not the capitalists, not the socialists, certainly not the dead philosopher himself, could control where it went next. Chapter 12. Red Scare and Theoretical Warfare. The 20th century didn't so much embrace Marx's ideas as violently wrestle with them in full public view. After the Russian Revolution, his bearded visage went global, staring sternly from Soviet banners, glaring from Cuban billboards, even making cameos in Chinese opera adaptations. Meanwhile, Western governments developed a nervous tic every time someone mentioned dialectical materialism. The Cold War wasn't just missiles and spies, it was the world's most intense book club debate.
Gone horrifically wrong in Moscow, Marx became less a thinker than a sacred icon. The Institute of Marxism-Leninism employed hundreds of scholars to produce definitive editions of his works and definitive interpretations to match. Woe betide any comrade who suggested Kapital might contain a single contradiction. Stalin, not known for his scholarly patience, purportedly kept a well-thumbed copy by his bedside, though whether he actually read it or just used it to flatten insects remains debated. The West responded with equal parts hysteria and appropriation. FBI agents infiltrated college Marxist study groups, only to discover they mostly involved undergraduates arguing about alienation over bad coffee. Hollywood pumped out anti-communist propaganda films, where square-jawed capitalists rescued workers from evil Bolsheviks, never noticing how perfectly this confirmed Marx's theories about ideology serving power. Even Disney got in on the act, producing an animated short where a cheerful American squirrel outwitted a gloomy Marxist. Oh. Yet some of the most interesting developments came from thinkers trapped between these poles. In an Italian prison, Antonio Gramsci filled notebooks with theories about cultural hegemony, how ruling classes maintain power not just through force, but by controlling what gets called common sense. In Germany, the Frankfurt School reinvented Marx's critique for the age of radio and advertising, while carefully avoiding any mention of actually overthrowing governments. Their reward? Being denounced by Stalinists and McCarthylists, a rare case of bipartisan disapproval. By the 1960s, Marx's ideas had escaped the ivory tower and the Politburo. Both French students scrawled his phrases on Parisian walls during May '68. Black Panthers distributed copies of the Communist Manifesto alongside breakfast programs. Even mainstream economists begrudgingly admitted he'd been right about capitalism's boom-bust cycles, if wrong about its imminent demise. The ultimate irony came when Wall Street firms started hiring Marxist analysts to predict the next crisis, proving yet again that capitalism would commodify absolutely anything, even its own gravediggers. Through it all, the old divisions persisted. Soviet bloc Marxists dismissed Western revisionists as bourgeois apologists. Western Marxists sneered at Soviet dogmatists for turning living theory into state religion. And actual workers, the people Marx wrote about, often found both camps equally incomprehensible. The prophet who predicted history would be decided by class struggle might have been amused to see it devolve into academic squabbles and propaganda wars. Or perhaps he'd just sigh, light another cigar, and get back to work. After all, the contradictions were piling up faster than anyone could analyze them. Chapter 13. Marx Goes Viral.
The 21st century was supposed to bury Marx for good, with the Soviet Union dissolved and China embracing socialism with capitalist characteristics. Even his most devoted followers began nervously updating their resumes. But history, that sly dialectician, had other plans. As the new millennium unfolded, the old theorist staged a comeback so improbable it would make a Hollywood producer blush. Not as a revolutionary icon, but as the patron saint of disaffected millennials, overworked gig workers, and anyone who'd ever stared at their Uber rating with existential dread. The Great Recession of 2008 served as Marx's unlikely revival tour. As Wall Street banks collapsed and governments bailed out billionaires, something peculiar happened.
Sales of Kapital spiked by 400%. Suddenly, everyone from Occupy Wall Street protesters to befuddled economics professors found themselves thumbing through the same dense Victorian prose that had gathered dust for decades. The irony was delicious. The same financial institutions Marx predicted would self-destruct were now inadvertently driving people to his work. Bookstores reported executives buying copies in plain brown wrappers, like Victorian gentlemen purchasing risque French novels. Academia underwent its own Marxist makeover. Gender studies departments dissected social reproduction theory. Who changes all those diapers and cooks all those meals that keep workers, well, working? Environmental scientists applied his concept of metabolic rift to climate change. Even business schools, those temples of capitalism, begrudgingly admitted his analysis of boom-bust cycles might have merit, though they carefully avoided mentioning the whole overthrow the system part. The ultimate indignity. Economics Nobel laureates started casually dropping Marxian terms like commodity fetishism at Davos cocktail parties, much to the horror of their hedge fund hosts. Hollywood, never one for subtlety, turned Marx into a cultural Rorschach test. Superhero movies featured villainous CEOs quoting Kapital between evil monologues. Prestige dramas depicted Marxist professors as either heroic truth-tellers or unhinged radicals, depending on the network. The pièce de résistance came when a streaming service greenlit the Marx and Engels Variety Hour, a surreal sketch comedy show that somehow made primitive accumulation funny. Critics called it Monty Python for the Theory Bro set. Then came the internet, where Marx found his true digital afterlife. Memes about late capitalism proliferated, juxtaposing $15 avocado toast with images of Victorian workhouses. TikTok videos explained alienation theory through skits about influencer. Someone even created a Marxist critique of cryptocurrencies so insightful it went viral before the inevitable NFT bubble burst. The revolution might not be televised, but it was definitely getting live tweeted. The workplace became Marx's most unexpected battleground. Tech workers formed Marxist breeding groups in Silicon Valley break rooms. Amazon warehouse employees circulated dog-eared copies of Kapital alongside union organizing pamphlets. Even Wall Street got in on the act. Hedge funds hired Marxist analysts to predict the next crisis, proving capitalism could commodify absolutely anything, even its own gravediggers. The most surreal moment came when workers at a Berlin startup unionized using an app called Class Consciousness 2.0, complete with push notifications about surplus value extraction. Through it all, Marx's specter haunted the contradictions of modern life. His face adorned everything from high-end streetwear to protest banners. His phrases were quoted equally by tenured radicals and algorithmic trading bots. The system he'd sought to overthrow had instead absorbed him, turning revolutionary critique into just another lifestyle brand. Whether this represented capitalism's ultimate triumph or its most delicious contradiction depended entirely on who you asked. As the 2020s rolled on, with climate catastrophe looming and inequality reaching Gilded Age levels, Marx's questions felt more urgent than ever. The answers, however, remained as elusive as they'd been in 1848. One thing was certain.
The old mole of history was still digging, And this time, he had Wi-Fi. The man who'd once written in near isolation would have marveled at seeing his ideas debated by millions online, though he'd probably hate the ads. Chapter 14. The Ghost in the Theory Machine. For all his brilliance, Marx left behind a minefield of unanswered questions and unintended consequences. The intellectual equivalent of a revolutionary IED that kept detonating in unexpected places. The man who saw capitalism's flaws with crystal clarity somehow missed how nationalism would trump class solidarity, how consumer culture would absorb dissent like a sponge, and how his own phrases would be weaponized by regimes he might have despised. The 20th century became a brutal stress test for his theories, leaving behind a trail of paradoxes that continue to haunt us today. Take the dictatorship of the proletariat, perhaps Marx's most unfortunate turn of phrase. What he envisioned as a temporary workers' democracy became in practice justification for one-party states from Moscow to Pyongyang. The results were grim enough to make even devoted Marxists wince. Show trials conducted in the name of dialectical materialism, gulags justified as re-education, and 5-year plans that somehow never quite reached year 6. The bitter irony, these so-called Marxist states often resembled the worst excesses of industrial capitalism, exploitative, hierarchical, and obsessed with production targets, just with more red flags and worse fashion. Then there was Marx's blind spot for nationalism. The man who declared, "Workers have no country," failed to predict how easily ethnic identity would override class consciousness. Polish workers sided with Polish capitalists against Russian socialists. Vietnamese peasants fought French colonizers before turning on their own bourgeoisie. Even the international socialist movement fractured along national lines when World War I broke out. German Marxists cheering for the Kaiser, French Marxists defending the Republic. The proletariat, it turned out, rather liked having countries after all. Capitalism's adaptability proved another miscalculation. Marx assumed the system would collapse under its own contradictions, not that it would learn to profit from those very contradictions. The same alienation he decried became a marketing strategy, authentic experiences sold to desk workers craving meaning. The commodification he analyzed now extended to revolutionary aesthetics itself, with Che Guevara's face on T-shirts and Das Kapital as a designer coffee table book. Even class struggle got gentrified. Brooklyn activists hashtagging number resistance while sipping $8 lattes. Perhaps most surprisingly, Marx underestimated how thoroughly capitalism could buy off segments of the working class. The mid-20th century saw Western factory workers trading revolutionary fervor for suburban homes and color TVs. What one Marxist theorist bitterly called the proletariat becoming petty bourgeois, without ceasing to be proletarian. Union bosses negotiated better wages while leaving the system intact. The revolutionary subject Marx pinned his hopes on seemed to vanish just as the contradictions grew sharper. Yet, for all these oversights, Marx's core insights kept returning like repressed memories. Every financial crisis revived interest in his analysis of capitalism's instability. Every new technology, from assembly lines to algorithms, brought fresh waves of alienation. Even his much-mocked prediction about capitalism's tendency toward monopoly looked prescient as tech giants gobbled up entire industries. The old contradictions kept resurfacing in new forms, like a game of ideological whack-a-mole. The greatest testament to Marx's legacy might be this.
After 150 years of failed predictions, brutal regimes invoking his name, and capitalism's endless reinventions, we still can't stop arguing about him. Conservatives blame him for everything from postmodernism to bad campus poetry. Leftists debate which of his ideas remain salvageable. Even centrists grudgingly admit he diagnosed problems they're still trying to solve, with policy tweaks. The theorist who wanted to change the world instead became a mirror, reflecting back whatever fears or hopes we bring to him. In the end, Marx's most enduring contribution might be the questions he left unanswered. How do we build a just economy without creating new oppressions? Can technology liberate workers instead of surveilling them? Is collective dignity possible without crushing individual freedom? These aren't just theoretical puzzles. They're the live wires sparking through every protest, movement, policy debate, and late-night dorm room argument today. The old revolutionary might not have had the solutions, but he reframed the problems with terrifying clarity. And in an age of climate crisis, algorithmic control, and yawning inequality, those problems won't be going away anytime soon. Chapter 15. Marx in the Age of Algorithmic Overlords. If the old revolutionary were to materialize in our world today, perhaps summoned by the collective frustration of gig workers or the eerie glow of cryptocurrency mining farms, he'd find both his wildest predictions and worst nightmares coming true in equal measure. The 21st century has become a funhouse mirror version of his prophecies. Billionaires launching themselves into space while their workers struggled to afford insulin. Artificial intelligence threatening to make human labor obsolete, and climate change proving that capitalism's externalities might just kill us all. The contradictions he identified haven't been resolved. They've metastasized into weirder, more virulent forms. Take the modern workplace. Marx wrote about alienation in Victorian factories, but even he couldn't have imagined the surreal detachment of today's digital labor. The Uber driver, rated below 4.8 stars. The content moderator, traumatized by filtering beheading videos for minimum wage. The Amazon warehouse worker, timed during bathroom breaks by algorithms that don't need sleep or health care. Exploitation has become so abstracted that workers often never see their actual employers, just apps, metrics, and the occasional passive-aggressive notification from the void. The factory's in your pocket, the foreman is an AI, and the proletariat has been rebranded as independent contractors. Then there's the spectacle of modern consumption, which would make Marx's head spin. The same workers being squeezed by late capitalism are drowning in its cheap comforts, endless streaming content to numb the stress of precarious employment, fast fashion to mask the stagnating wages, viral challenges distracting from the erosion of labor rights. Alienation has been commodified and sold back to us as self-care. Even revolutionary impulses get repackaged. The activists' "Fight the System" slogan printed on sweatshop-made T-shirts. The anti-capitalist manifesto available for next-day prime delivery.
Of Marx's ecological foresight, his concept of metabolic rift, capitalism's tendency to rupture humanity's relationship with nature, reads like a blueprint for our current crisis. The same system that treats workers as disposable also treats the planet as an infinite resource and bottomless waste dump. The irony? Those feeling the consequences first and hardest are the very working-class communities Marx championed, while the billionaire class builds apocalypse bunkers in New Zealand. Yet, for all this bleak confirmation of his theories, our world would baffle Marx in crucial ways. The working class has fractured into a kaleidoscope of identities and interests. Traditional factories have given way to app-based gig work, making collective action harder to organize. The very concept of labor is blurring. Is a TikTok creator a worker or a micro-entrepreneur? A programmer training AI models, a proletarian or part of the machine? Perhaps most surprisingly, Marx might be stunned by capitalism's cultural victory. His assumption that immiseration would lead inevitably to revolution failed to account for how effectively discontent could be channeled into consumerism and culture. The same algorithms that exploit workers also feed them personalized distractions. The anger that might have fueled class consciousness gets diverted into partisan shouting matches. The system learned to sell us the rope as a limited edition designer accessory. And yet, in the cracks of this system, Marx's ghost keeps stirring. Unionization efforts at Starbucks and Amazon, tenant organizations fighting algorithmic rent hikes, the growing movement for a 4-day workweek. These aren't full-blown revolutions, but they prove the underlying tensions he identified haven't disappeared. They've just put on new disguises. The old man's final surprise might be this. The most radical applications of his ideas are coming not from political revolutionaries, but from scientists and philosophers. Ecologists using his theories to model sustainable economies. Technologists exploring post-capitalist platforms based on cooperation rather than extraction. Feminist economists expanding his analysis to include unpaid care work. After centuries of being claimed and distorted by political movements, Marx's greatest legacy might be as a tool for diagnosing our present and imagining futures beyond the limits of our current system. As we face down climate catastrophe, AI disruption, and spiraling inequality, Marx's fundamental question remains as urgent as ever. Who benefits from this system, and who pays the price? The answers keep changing. The question won't go away.
Epilogue: The Spectre That Still Walks. And that's the story of Karl Marx, the man who saw the gears of capitalism grinding workers to dust and spent his life trying to stop them. Before you drift off to sleep, let's retrace his extraordinary journey through the fog of history. We began in Trier, where a restless boy with a philosopher's mind grew up between Enlightenment ideals and Prussian oppression. That young Marx, brilliant, argumentative, and allergic to authority, would become the revolutionary who fled across Europe, from censored newspapers in Cologne to Parisian cafes buzzing with radical dreams. Then came Engels, the capitalist's son who funded the revolution, bringing first-hand accounts of factory horrors that fueled Marx's greatest work. Together they penned the Communist Manifesto in a blaze of inspiration. Its famous lines, "Workers of the world, unite," echoing far beyond their damp London exile. London became Marx's second home as he wrote Kapital, that monstrous masterpiece dissecting capitalism's hidden abyss. Picture him there, ink-stained, boil-ridden, and utterly consumed by the question, what if work didn't have to break people? The Paris Commune's bloody collapse broke his heart. The First International's infighting exhausted him. Personal tragedies piled up, dead children, a dying wife, and his own failing health. Yet even in his final years, Marx kept revising, rethinking, and raging against a system he saw as fundamentally unjust. After his death, history took his ideas and ran wild. Lenin wielded them in Russia. The Cold War twisted them into propaganda. Today, his ghost lingers in union battles, climate crises, and the quiet fury of gig workers staring at their Uber ratings at 2 a.m. So why does Marx matter tonight? Because whether you're nodding off after a double shift or wondering why rent swallows your paycheck whole, his central question remains.
Who benefits from this system, and who pays the price? The answers are still unfolding. Now, as the candle of history flickers low, let's leave Marx where we found him, in that quiet corner of the British Museum, scribbling furiously, chasing a fairer world one page at a time. The rest is up to us. If these journeys into history help you unwind, do us a kindness. Like, subscribe, and comment. What stays with you about Marx's story, and who should we explore next? Now, close your eyes, let these ideas drift, and we'll meet again soon for another story. Sleep well.